Thank you, Virginia. And I really can't see the participant list, so let me give you an introduction because I assume there's some people on here that don't know who I am or who REG is. Regulatory Economics Group is an economic consulting firm. We've been around about 23 years. We took over the Ernst & Young energy management practice back in 1998. And we primarily operate in the liquids pipeline, oil pipeline sector, but we sometimes stray outside that a little bit, but that's kind of our main forte. I'm one of the founders and the CEO. And we want to take a minute today to talk a little bit about benchmarking, and specifically, with the XBRL requirement, I think comes some opportunities here with the Data Hub product that the folks at HData have put together. And so I think there's some opportunities for those of you that work in the industry, be it oil, gas, or electric, and you're looking to do some benchmarking. And so what this is a little bit about what our presentation is going to be today. Talk about the process, talk about comparative performance benchmarking, and then give you a couple ideas of how this might work with regard to oil pipelines. I think Hudson's going to come in and talk about electric utilities towards the end of my presentation, since he's a little more familiar with those, or has talked with people who are more familiar with those.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Bob, thank you. Hey, everybody, I'm so excited to be presenting alongside Bob, but I'm going to stand on the shoulders of a giant because Bob's career and business and stature in the oil pipeline industry have been built on being able to do this analysis. And I'm going to do my best to analogize from oil pipelines, which represent some of our audience, to electric utilities, which represents another chunk of our audience. So thanks so much, Bob. I'm excited to stand on the shoulders of a giant and take it away.
And Hudson, we've never met, but I'm 6'8", so I'm literally a giant. So, very intuitive, very intuitive. All right, so when we get this process started, and we'll save some time for questions towards the end, we can get to the next slide. This is kind of a workflow of a generic benchmarking process. For some of you that maybe haven't been involved in this, benchmarking was pretty much in vogue 20, 30 years ago. I think people still use it some today, but with, like I said, with the new products that we're seeing coming out, the Data Hub, I think you're going to have a lot more information at your fingertips where you'll be able to do this yourself. 30 years ago when we did benchmarking, we had to go out and solicit groups of companies and send out very intrusive surveys, and it would take months to get data to come back in. And then you spend a long time trying to figure out, who are the appropriate peers for each other. So I think now with data becoming much more available at your desktop, you can do some of this internally. But anyway, so looking at the flow diagram here, obviously, you need to kind of determine the areas that are going to be meaningful to benchmark. For oil pipelines, for example, because we operate under a commission determined index that gets reviewed every 5 years, that would be a likely candidate. Looking at metrics that would influence the commission's oil pipeline index, because that's what affects most of our rates. Very important that you select team members within your company. You get your champions, you get your subject matter experts on those areas where you're going to do the benchmarking. What you don't want to find is you get to the end and someone says, well, gee, we disagree with this because, John, Bob, Sally, whoever in accounting wasn't involved, and they know something that you don't know in this process. So make sure you get the right team members. It's real important to get management buy-in also when you're going to do this, and you set appropriate management expectations, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But develop your performance metrics and measurements, and by this, so if what you're looking at is operating expense, what areas of the operating expense do you want to look at? Do you want to look at something very specific like the cost of salary and benefits, or are you looking at things more broader than that? So develop those metrics and measurements, and then identify who you want to benchmark against. And so this horizontal bar in this flow diagram kind of represents the scale of the different choices you have. I mean, you could benchmark the industry, which would be almost like what the commission does every 5 years on oil pipelines when they review the performance of their index against the changes in cost on an industry-wide level. Once you do that, you can compare yourself to the industry, or if you were able to identify a select group of pipelines, electric utilities, whatever, substitute in your whatever is appropriate for your industry in there, a group, then you could benchmark against that specific peer group. Or maybe you're in a situation where you have, of another company, maybe it's someone that you have head-to-head competition with, and you want to benchmark specifically one system versus the other system because you're looking for some competitive intelligence and to see how you're performing versus that other company. But you'll need to make that decision on what's relevant, because not everything is going to be relevant. There are times, obviously, and I'll speak mainly to the oil pipeline side, but I'm sure the same will happen on the electric side. It wouldn't make sense for a Colonial pipeline, which is 40 some odd inch diameter pipeline, 36 inch diameter pipeline, to benchmark itself against an 8-inch pipeline that only is 100 miles long. Colonial runs from Houston all the way up the eastern seaboard. I think everybody's familiar with Colonial after the last month or two. So once you identify, what you want to benchmark and who you want to benchmark against, then specify, you do the actual benchmarking process and do the comparisons. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then go through and review the results of that. Try to identify any gaps, try to identify any trends, which to me are actually more important, and then identify what changes that you think you need to make in response to that, measure the results, and then you start this loop over again. So this is kind of a continuous improvement loop. Once you start the benchmarking process, the idea is that you'll try to implement change, and then you'll go back and you'll measure again after some relevant period to see whether or not your change has been effective or not. So that's the generic benchmarking process. And then we probably jump into the next slide. So what does benchmarking do? Well, it can provide a consistent basis for comparison. And that may seem obvious, but without a benchmark or without some form of a trend analysis, who are you really comparing yourself to? And I think of benchmarking when I think of annual planning, budgeting, long-range planning. Most people don't go through the process of zero-based budgeting anymore, and so you're just incrementally budgeting year after year. And how do you know that incremental budget's the right number? It can help you identify performance gaps between you and your competitors. It may facilitate the search for leading and best practices to the extent that's something you're looking for, and it may provide a foundation for developing plans on how to close the gap if you're comparing yourself to a specific peer group that you're competing against, and then you can identify the trends over time to see what kind of changes that you can make to kind of close the gap between yourself and other members of that peer group. Now what it doesn't do is it doesn't provide you the reason for the performance gap, especially when we're dealing with Form 6 information, because it's at a pretty high level. You don't have necessarily the level of granularity that you would if you actually had the detailed accounting information for the company, and it doesn't necessarily explain how the results are achieved to get the leading and best practices, nor does it give you the appropriate targets for your performance. You're going to have to look at what these companies are doing. One of the things I tell people a lot is when you do benchmarking, you have to be careful of what I call the Lake Wobegon effect. And some of you I may be dating myself here when I say Lake Wobegon. The Lake Wobegon is the summer camp where all the kids were above average, right? And so no kid was below average. And one of the problems you have when you do benchmarking, and this is where I talked about, you need to make sure you manage expectations of management. If you walk into management and say, I've done this big benchmarking analysis, and good news, we're in the upper 25 percentile of my peer group. Don't be surprised if management yawns and says, yeah, we already knew that. We already know we're the best, right? Everybody thinks they're the best. And so they're not going to take it as a meaningful insight. If you walk in and say, gee, we're in the lower 25% of our peer group, what you may end up with is people saying, well, you obviously have the wrong peer group. You compared us against people who aren't like us, right? And so that's why I think early on, when I talked about making sure you select the appropriate team members and you get management buy-in on what it is that you're looking for, it's really important to do that up front and then think about, what's important. And we're going to talk about that in a second also. Look at my notes here real quick. Yeah, so I think it's real important to get management buy-in. So let's flip to the next slide and let's talk about what might be some benchmarkings that could be relevant. So given the level of data that we're dealing with here, for example, if I was to benchmark another oil pipeline, one thing I might look for if I was an operator is total controllable expenses. So you go to page 301, 302, look at the operating expenses, look at those expenses that are controllable, and then benchmark that on a barrel mile basis. Now the question is, do you want to benchmark that against the industry, or do you want to benchmark that against a particular group? I think both can have meaning. The closer you can find a peer group that resembles your operating characteristics, obviously the more meaningful it's going to be. But as we talked about, given the fact that the commission has now set up an oil pipeline index, which governs how most oil pipeline rates get changed, benchmarking yourself against the industry gives you an idea of whether or not your company is beating the index in the interim time periods. And you can actually drill down on that a little bit and look at what I call controllable operations and maintenance expense. So that would be all the 300 series accounts for oil pipelines. And then you can look at controllable G&A expense, which would basically be the G&A expenses that are not related to depreciation, taxes, insurance. So we're talking about things like salary, materials and supplies. Are we hearing an echo? Is that me?
I think it's Hudson, actually. Oh, there. Yeah.
Okay. So what controllable G&A would be things like salaries, benefits, materials and supplies, outside services, and rentals. I would not include in that category things like depreciation, amortization, insurance, casualty loss, pipeline taxes, or anything to do with ARO, because those are items that, once you've decided to make an investment in capital, those items you have less ability to control how they show up on your income statement or your expense statement on the Form 6 each year. So, you look at that. So that basically gives you a measure of if you're doing like I said, your operating plan and you're trying to figure out, is a 5% increase over last year the right number or not? Looking at, peer groups or looking at the industry would give you an idea whether or not from a budgeting perspective, you're in the right ballpark. The second two on here, average haul, which is barrel miles divided by barrels, which gives you an idea of what's the average length of haul that a pipeline would be making. And the next one, the annual change in throughput. Those two are more benchmarkings. If you had, for example, a market, say that you were serving the Chicago market with refined products, and you wanted to know, how am I doing compared to my competitors? Well, if you created a peer group of the other pipelines that were also serving Chicago with refined products, and then each time a 6Q or an annual report comes out, you go through the data portal and you look at, well, our volumes went up 5%, but Explorer and these other companies went up 10%. That's giving you some indication that at least from what the change in the market has been, you're not keeping up with your competitors, or maybe you'll find hopefully the other way around where your volumes went up 10%, your competitors only went up 5%. But it could give you some information with regard to the level of competition and how you're faring against that. And then this last one on here, cost of service on a barrel mile basis. So every 5 years, the commission goes through and they calculate what we call the index offset, which is the adjustment that they're going to make to the producer price index. This offset can be a negative number. It can be a positive number. It's basically the statistical number the commission computes that reconciles the 5-year historical change in pipeline cost versus the 5-year historical change in the producer price index for finished goods. What they basically do is they take the entire industry, they look at their cost of service at time period 0 and time period 5 on a cost per barrel mile basis. Now there's some intermediate steps they do in here where they have to deal with mergers and acquisitions and things like that, which you're not going to be able to do with the data that you have. And then they data trim the set anywhere from, they take the inner 80 percentile down to the inner 50 percentile. But at the end of the day, they come up with this average cost of service per barrel mile change in the industry. And that less the historical change in the PPI becomes the offset for the next 5 years. So as we get closer to that 5-year mark where the commission is going to review this, people are interested in wanting to know, where's the commission going to be in year 5? Are they is the next index going to be, plus 2%, or is it going to be minus 1%? And so this kind of a benchmark can give you some information on where the commission may be leaning based on the information that's readily available. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions on oil pipelines before Hudson gets in to talking about electric utilities.
Yeah, we'd love to see what questions people have for Bob. I've got a couple before we start applying some of this to electric utilities. Alternately, if anybody has questions for Bob, feel free to type them into the chat window here on this Google Meet meeting platform. One of the things that I'm excited about, Bob, seeing these metrics here, is that now that we're going to have instant access into every number from every schedule in every form filed by the regulated oil pipelines in Form 6 and Form 6Q. We're going to be able to calculate all these things automatically instead of having to pull them from the PDFs. So for example, you talk about that probably not visible here because the size is so small, but the table there actually comes from an export from the FERC Pro Data Hub. We were able to go in and calculate out operating expenses, pull the number of barrel miles, and do a really fast calculation of Opex per barrel mile for fiscal year 2018. And I was especially interested to see that that list that you have there, which might be too small, but when you download the slides from Virginia, you're going to be able to see it. One standout there is Enbridge. Enbridge has an Opex per barrel mile that is very low for such a large entity. It's by far the largest entity with an Opex per barrel mile that is that low, that enough to place it in the top 20. I guess I don't want to put you on the spot too much, Bob, because you know the industry, but I'm curious if you might notice any other anomalies like that one when you calculate Opex per barrel mile.
And that's a good point there, Hudson. I guess two things from my book. I mean, Enbridge has a low number, but it's relative, right? I mean, look at their barrel miles. They because they're such a long system and they carry such a large amount of volume, they have a significant number of barrel miles. We're talking what 800 billion. And that has to be a rounded number. There's probably some zeros. If you took this number out of the Form 6, I think there's probably at least 3 zeros that aren't showing up on here. Sometimes people report in the thousands. So that's something else to be wary of when you're pulling the data that you know what your proper units are. But I think for the comparison purposes, all this works. But Enbridge is such a big player. They have a lot of barrel miles. I think you'd see the same thing if you had a Colonial on here. So when it comes to comparing Opex per barrel mile, to me, that's relevant if you're able to find someone who is similar to your system. So if you operate a 12-inch pipeline that's roughly 300 miles long and you're running refined products to a half a dozen terminals, if you could find someone else that operates another line in that 10, 12, 14 inch with similar distance, and then you start comparing your Opex per barrel mile, that's to me is on a head-to-head comparison is meaningful. What I'd be looking for here is not what Enbridge did today, but where was Enbridge last year versus where they are today? Did their operating expenses go up 5% over the last year while mine went up 10%? And in that case, I would say, gee, what's going on here? So what you're looking for also is the trends, and I think that's where this data becomes really helpful because you not only have the annual Form 6, you have the 6Qs, and so you'll be able to track this every quarter as things are happening. And so, you might find out that, Enbridge's number is higher, couple, 3/4 out of the year, then all of a sudden in the fourth quarter it dipped, which would lead me to the question, was there some kind of an accounting charge or something that happened, which was a one-time event that may have caused those numbers to deviate? I'm not saying that that's what's going on with Enbridge here, because I think that it's just probably pure volume. But I find some of these, like Energy Transfer, at what is that, like 6 basis points a mile?
Tiny.
So, I think you just have to look at some of these and see how they trend over time. The other thing you have to be concerned about, which is why I took the total operating expense per mile and also suggested breaking it down between operations and maintenance and G&A, is sometimes these companies, the G&A is done more by a parent, and they may have service agreements or some, so you're not seeing 100% of the expenses, where other companies, they have all their legal staff, all their engineering staff, everything is within the company, and so it's being reported there. Where on another entity, it might be an allocated cost that, and sometimes these allocated corporate overhead numbers don't always show up in the Form 6. You like for them to be, but sometimes they're not. And so I would, again, I think looking at trends over time and seeing what's the relative change from year to year on these companies is a meaningful statistic also.
Thanks very much, Bob. And we can do that. We've got, for the most part, since we've got quarterly breakdowns in the oil pipeline filings, just as we have in the gas pipeline filings and the electric utility filings, it's possible to do that. It's possible to see trends. As I think most of you have seen the FERC Pro Data Hub before, and so from our presentations that the FERC has done something that no regulator has ever done, as far as I know. The FERC has actually published a bunch of retroactive data from previous years, even before switching from the fillable PDF to the new XBRL format. The FERC published all of the filings from 2018 in the XBRL format. That's why we're able to do the calculations that we can do in the FERC Pro Data Hub. The FERC has also announced that in October, it will publish the entire previous decade. That means that we'll be able to do longer term analysis. Right now, the things that you're going to be seeing are just from the 2018 filing year. And so for the most part, that's going to be 2018, and it's going to be 2017 in each place where the filer has to also report the same period in the previous year.
Sure.
Bob, I think you're going to say something.
No, I just said that's terrific, because that's going to allow you from day one to start doing some of those trend analysis. So that's going to be great.
That's right. I look forward to doing it. We're actually, even though we don't have the full decade until the FERC goes ahead and publishes it, we are already onboarding our customers into the FERC Pro Data Hub. And in fact, we have we're going to be onboarding a large gas company into the FERC Pro Data Hub tomorrow. Super excited about that. I'm going to make one more call for questions from any of our group. And then after that, I want to make a couple of observations for those of our audience members who work for electric utilities.
If I could say one more thing.
Oh, sure thing, Bob. One
more thing, Hudson. One word of caution that I also talk to people about when I talk about benchmarking is you need to be aware and cognizant of any litigation issues you have going on when you're doing your benchmarking. We haven't seen yet in any rate cases anyone coming in and making arguments about benchmarking with regard to prudency claims. But I think if you're doing this internally, I think you want to make sure you're working with your legal department and make sure you've got the right caveats on the documents about how you use these documents and what they're used for, and how this is not necessarily indicative of what your cost would be. So you don't find yourself in a discovery battle turning over things that you don't really want to have to explain.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we actually had that conversation. We had a conversation with the Association of Consumer Advocates, which, as you might know, most states have a consumer advocate who's responsible for responding to electric utilities rate cases. Had a good conversation with consumer advocates, and one of the issues that is major in rate case litigation, which is a phenomenon in both the electric utility industry and also oil pipelines. One of the issues that's important is making sure that you show the provenance of your numbers. You got to certify your numbers if you use them in a rate case. One thing that we can do in the FERC Pro Data Hub is we can show exactly when you see a number, you can click on the number and automatically see where it comes from in the filing, so that it's possible to show the provenance. If you've got a calculated field, we can do a report for you that shows what underlying fields from which forms it's calculated from. That means we can help you with provenance. Whereas if you were pulling them from the PDFs and maybe manually typing them into a spreadsheet, you'd have to keep careful track of where you're getting them from. We can trace them all the way back to the source.
That's great. That's a big help.
In a second, I'm going to see if I can reclaim the time or reclaim the screen so that I can show a few things related to electric utilities. But as we're switching over, any other questions for Bob before we switch from the world of oil pipelines to the world of electric utilities? All right, great. We've got our slide here for electric utilities. A few of the metrics that we've gotten so far that our customers in the electric utility industry have asked us to calculate. The one that I think most of you who have seen the FERC Pro Data Hub already know about is rate base. For those who don't know, rate base is the combined value of all of an electric utility's electricity producing assets, but excluding those assets that don't produce electricity. So you've got to include the value of your power plant. You've got to exclude the value of your office building and then subtract depreciation of the power plant, but not subtract depreciation of the office building. So it's a bit of an extract. Each state commission has a slightly different way of calculating rate base, but it can be calculated from the fields in a FERC Form 1 or a FERC Form 3 queue. And so that's what we did. We plugged the calculation into the FERC Pro Data Hub. And what you see on the right-hand side there is we calculated rate base for AEP Texas, Nevada Power, and third power company. Can't read it.
Electric.
Tampa, yes.
Tampa
Thank you. Oh, hey, Jacob, I think you're on. I think we've got Tampa Electric on here. Jacob, we calculated your rate base for you, and we did a quick extract, and those are, you can see how rate base has changed for those three utilities from 2017 up into 2018. Rate base is important because it is so crucial when electric utilities are going for rate cases, seeking permission from state commissions to change the rates that they charge. And this kind of comparison between, even though utilities don't compete with each other the same way as pipelines do, utilities have to do peer comparisons constantly within the context of rate case litigation in order to justify proposed increases. And then, of course, those who respond to rate cases, like those consumer advocates that I mentioned earlier, those who respond to rate cases have to do peer comparisons as well. Peer comparisons using rate base or any other metric are a laborious exercise until today, until it's possible to automatically pull some of those things from the FERC Pro Data Hub. I want to also mention non-fuel O&M, non-fuel operations and maintenance expense. Some common proxies for efficiency in electric power generation are determined by taking non-fuel operations and maintenance expense. The way that you calculate that for an electric utility is you've got to grab the operations expenses and the maintenance expenses, which helpfully are broken down. And I'll show you this in a second. They're helpfully broken down by the different types of power generation, but then you've got to pull fuel out of the equation. And that is because the cost of fuel varies. And the variations in the cost of fuel are not a driver of an electric utility's efficiency or not. So therefore, you've got to not count fuel in the operation and maintenance expense calculation. Once you've done that, you can divide that by kilowatt hour to get a rough proxy for efficiency. You can divide that by revenue to get a rough proxy for return on investment. We've been in touch with a lot of electric utilities that are doing this. They've got spreadsheets that compare themselves to their peers, and they've had to laboriously pull the information out of PDF documents. We're building this for them in an interactive fashion. Virginia, if I can share my screen, I'm going to show a couple of these things just on my screen here. Okay, sharing screen. And I'm also conscious of time because our colleague Anand Padmanabhan from our partner Iris, which delivers the FERC Pro Iris Carbon Filing Solution, will be presenting after me. So we'll make sure to make time for him. I'm going to demonstrate to you a couple of the things that I was describing. First, I'm going to give you rate base. I'm looking at the Virginia Electric and Power Company and the Union Electric Company. Here is data from the balance sheets of each showing up in the FERC Pro Data Hub. I mentioned that we calculated rate base using input from the Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commission. Here's rate base. It just shows up in our interface, same as some of the other numbers. When you click on it, you can see the calculation that went into it. So you can see all of the different numbers that we have added into that in order to show you how rate base has changed. And indeed, you can see between Q1, Q2, and Q3 in 2018, we've seen some appreciation, just like what you might expect. We can do a seamless comparison of rate base between Virginia and Union or any other 2 or more FERC regulated electric utilities. All right, I'm going to move over to operations and maintenance expenses. Same 2 companies, Virginia Electric and Power Company and Union Electric Company. And we've calculated their non-fuel O&M per megawatt hour sold as a total for all modes of fuel generation. But we've also calculated that for steam generation and nuclear generation. And you can see some interesting differences here. You can see that for Virginia, non-fuel operation and maintenance expenses for steam power, and that includes coal power plants. I had to have this explained to me by an industry expert. Steam really means coal, anything else that has a turbine. Non-fuel operation and maintenance expenses for those coal steam power plants per megawatt hour generated is $24,124 for fiscal year 2018 for Virginia Electric, and for Union Electric it's only $4,998. So we'd want to dig into why that is, and we probably could go into it on a quarterly basis, and maybe we could figure that out. I'm going to click on the calculation and I can see the numbers that it came from. We've put this into the FERC Pro Data Hub as a calculated field. So every user of the FERC Pro Data Hub can pull this and can see where it comes from. But what if you've got one of our other metrics? What if you want to calculate non-fuel operation and maintenance expenses per dollar of revenue? Well, we haven't built that one in as a calculated field in the FERC Pro Data Hub. Fortunately, our API tool gives you an answer here. The API tool gives you the flexibility to calculate whatever you want. I'm going to pull up Virginia. Here's a Virginia Electric and Power Company. I'm going to add that to my list. I'm going to pull up Union Electric Company. I'm going to add that to my list. I'm going to find all the steam operation. I'm going to remind myself of the titles of each of my terms here. I want to find non-fuel steam O&M. So I'm going to find fuel steam power generation costs. I'm going to add that to my list because I don't want to include that. And I'm going to include power production expenses steam. Power production expenses steam power. I'm going to add that to my list. Then I'm going to change the name of this template, Virginia and Union steam costs with fuel. I'm going to save that. And then I can hit 2018 because that is the year for which we have all the data. And here it is. I can hit download, and now I've got an Excel spreadsheet of that. This means that I can basically calculate any term, even if my friends at FERC Pro, meaning me, have not built that into the system for me. So we've got enough flexibility to be able to take really any calculated field that you might want, whether it's built into the FERC Pro platform or not, and generate a KPI. I'm glad to have this practice because tomorrow, when we bring our gas pipeline customer into the FERC Pro Data Hub, I'm going to have to show them this again. So you guys are my guinea pigs, and I appreciate that. We're excited to be working on this with all of our customers in the oil, the gas, and the electric utility industry. And I'm eager to have any questions about how the Data Hub works or why we're able to do this. I'm happy to field them. And I can hear some of the reports that I was experiencing, and I appreciate that Anand muted me forcibly back when my speaker was causing the challenge here from my office. And in a moment, I'm going to turn things.
Are you throwing a challenge?
Maybe I'll leave you, Anand. All right, Virginia, you can start sharing your screen again, and I'm going to transition over. As you know, FERC Pro includes two solutions. It includes the FERC Pro Data Hub, which I've just been showing you, and it also includes the Iris Carbon filing solution to help you comply with the XBRL reporting requirements that will kick in from the FERC in December 2021. I'm excited to let you all know that we have a number of technical updates coming to all of the users of our Iris Carbon filing solution. And Anand, who is the president of Iris Business Services LLC and designed most of the filing solution, is going to run through what those changes are and how we're enhancing the experience for our filing solution customers. Anand, fire away. Fire away.
Thank you, Hudson. Yes, good afternoon, everybody.
I said file away because that's what our users are all doing. Sorry, go ahead, Anand.
Oh, okay. So thank you, Hudson. Yes, we shall file away. Well, all these points that we have on the slide is basically applicable for everybody, just not for Iris Carbon users. But yes, we're going to talk about what are the next steps, what are the milestones, and what are some of FERC's expectations, and what should filers be looking at going forward. A number of technical issues need to be addressed before a company starts filing. But I thought before we head to that, I would give a brief, links and which talk about what FERC is expecting from all the stakeholders in the market. One is FERC is the current taxonomy, which was released on April 15th, is what is going to be applicable for the Q3 filing. They've also indicated that a new revised taxonomy is expected in Q1 of 2022. But that's not going to be a major change, no new schedules or no new line items to be reported. It will be basically a little bit of cleaning up of the taxonomy, some tweaks here and there, but it's not going to be a major change, which means from Q2 of 2022 onwards, there'll be two taxonomies applicable at that point of time. FERC has also indicated that they do not see that there are going to be repeated changes to the taxonomy. So that is, less of a headache to monitor constant changes in the taxonomy. So that is going to be a big review, big help. So while the new taxonomy is being considered and they already have a list of points to address, they have also opened up the taxonomy for public comment, which has always been there. So if you have the time and the energy to go through the taxonomy, it would be great if you could look at it and give in your inputs as whatever stakeholder, either the filer or a consumer of the data, to address some of the nuances of the taxonomy and help it to be improved, so that when Q1, the new release is there, we have all the relevant inputs. Now, as you're aware, the April 15th was the version 1.5, which is the taxonomy to go forward. All older versions of the taxonomy have been purged and they have all been removed. And in fact, FERC has also given a link to the taxonomy history page, which gives you which taxonomy is applicable for which form and for which period. So going forward, you will continue to see updates to this. So you will have no confusion as to what is the applicable taxonomy when you visit the taxonomy history page. Another thing which FERC is encouraging you to do is to do test filings. Now, the objective of the test filings is manifold. One is to see that the output generated by the system you're using meets the FERC validation rules and their validation engine, which they have on their portal. So it is good to run test the submission and ensure that the output generated by your system meets the FERC standard. The second is there are validation rules which have been built into the taxonomy and into the application, into the system itself. Now, those rules have to be met. Now, Visual Fox Pro obviously was not as comprehensive as an XBRL taxonomy can be. And therefore, some of the errors which were probably slipped through a Visual Fox Pro system would be caught in the new XBRL system, the e-form refreshed system. So it would be wise to run as many tests as you can. They're not stopping you from filing even a previous year's filing. Run it through and test the system and see what kind of errors come up, so that then you can internally tweak your processes, be able to then have error over the coming months to do those test filings. Now, the platform is going to be available only till 30th September for test filings, after which FERC is going to clean out the data and bring in the 10 years of data that they're converting into the platform. So therefore, so you have time till 30th September to do all the test filings that you would like to carry out and ensure that your processes are working in line. Now, as you're aware, Q3 submission deadline is 31st of December. You don't want to be rushing in and spoiling your holiday season, so you better be prepared. Ideally, you should be ready to file by late November, so that your holiday season is not interrupted. So therefore, the test filing will definitely have an impact and help you improve your processes. Another key thing we have noticed in some of our engagements with various customers is the confusion with CID, and especially when there are multiple subsidiaries, it becomes important that your CID or the company identification number is clearly matched. Now, FERC has given the list, which is actually available on their records. So you need to check, and if there is a mismatch, you need to correct it and ensure that you have the right CID for the filing. Otherwise, it is not going to be accepted by FERC. That is an important thing that you have to be aware of. If you want to get into the details as to what are the changes from the Visual Fox Pro system, which led to the development of the first version of the taxonomy and the changes to the taxonomy which came through, FERC has also made that available through their change logs, and that is available. And once you download this presentation, you will have the link to see those changes. You will also get to see the validation rules which are going to be applied on the data you're submitting. It is really complex. It is, completely Dutch to me. It's difficult to understand some of the technical files out there. We are hoping to bring a session in the coming months on how to read the XBRL document, as well as to understand what those validation rules are. So we hope to bring it up in the subsequent forum. But you could always visit the FERC website to get an idea as to what those validation rules are about, and you could prepare and check that that the data that you are generating meets those validation rules. FERC, as I mentioned, is converting 10 years of data, so which means that your Q1 and Q2 for 2021 submissions will be converted into XBRL, and that will be available for download. So it is important that the systems that you use have the ability to take in XBRL data, so that then you already have a Q1 and a Q2 data available for roll forward functionalities. So that is important that you look into your system, that it has the ability to upload a filing which is made available by FERC. So that's all that I have to share at the moment. Any questions, I'm happy to address. And Hudson, back to you.
Sure thing. Thank you, Anand. We're excited about working through this process of test filings with all of our customers, because the more test filings you work on over the summer, The less foreign the process is going to be when the first official XBRL formatted filing has to be submitted when you have to file away in December 2021, and it's for real. Happy to see some people offering questions in the chat window. Please keep those coming if there are any other questions that people have as a result of these presentations by Bob, by myself, by Anand. Grateful for all of that. I would love to just open it up in the last few minutes that we have. Oh, good. I'm glad that we're able to get some resolution there for some of our constituents. I'll open it up in the last few minutes that we have. If there are any questions or comments from any of our audience on any of these topics, or even off topic, now's the time to share them.
And we can change go ahead.
Yeah.
I have one I'll throw out to you. When you were running your little API tool there and you were pulling out the information to calculate the non-fuel cost, is there any limitation on the number of companies you could put in that API, or the number of data points you could pull it in any one download?
There's no limitation. If we have more than 500, it moves kind of slow. But we only have 200 some companies in the oil pipeline data set, and then 300 some in the gas pipeline data set, and I think about the same number in electric. If you wanted to do a complex calculation involving 500 data fields, the platform would move slowly. But below that, it's the restrictions are not profound.
So, and that's data fields, combination of companies and items. So 100 companies, 5 fields would be 500 data fields?
No, just one or the other. It wouldn't be too hard to calculate. I think when you earlier on, Bob, when you were showing your slide, and I had included a little snapshot of the expense per barrel mile, the operating expense per barrel mile, that actually was a snapshot from every company in the industry, and that was not hard for me to do.
Okay. And then second is when you use that API and you're going to download, is there a way that you can format or get the data to come in a certain format? I assume you download it into a CSV file, or does it go to an Excel file, or?
The export button gives you an Excel file, but then once it's there, it can easily be imported into. Some of our customers have more advanced BI tools like Microsoft Power BI or Tableau. Once you've got it in Excel, you can put it into whatever you want.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much, Bob. Any other questions?